welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a seriously high-stakes window of history, India from 1905 to 1909. Now, if you just glance at the headlines, this period kind of looks like the story of a massive political movement that just ran out of steam and collapsed. But as we're going to see, that is only half the story. In reality, this seemingly failed movement actually forged the absolute blueprint for modern India's struggle for independence. The tactics, the bitter divisions, and the laws locked into place during these 4 crucial years literally set the stage for the rest of the 20th century. Let's get right into it. Here's our map for today. We'll kick things off with A Movement Fizzles Out, uncover the unseen turning point, explore the great Surat Split, look at repression and strategy, and finally, decode the Morley-Minto Reforms.
Chapter 1, A Movement Fizzles Out, the Decline of the Swadeshi Era.
So, by 1908, the open phase of the Swadeshi and boycott movement, which remember was initially sparked by the Partition of Bengal, went from this roaring fire to barely a flicker. You might be wondering, why did it collapse so fast? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was basically a perfect storm. First off, the government came down hard. I mean, severe repression. Second, the movement just didn't build a disciplined party structure to actually withstand that kind of pressure. Because of all that repression by 1908, the movement was essentially leaderless. The heavy hitters were either arrested, deported, or just retired from active politics altogether. On top of that, internal squabbles were tearing the leadership apart. And looking at the demographics, the movement mostly stayed confined to the upper and middle classes and the zamindars. It totally missed the broader masses, especially the peasantry. At the end of the day, it's incredibly hard to sustain a mass movement at a fever pitch for a long time without some seriously solid foundations in place.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, The Unseen Turning Point, Laying the Blueprint.
I want to ask you this directly. Was it all just for nothing? Looking at the historical record, the answer is a resounding no. What's really fascinating here is to think of this era as a sort of rehearsal. It was actually a massive leap forward because it drew totally new, previously untouched demographics right into the political sphere. We're talking students, women, workers, and new sections of both urban and rural populations getting involved for the very first time. People were waking up, and they were learning how to take really bold political stances. But the absolute most vital legacy of this era? The introduction of Swaraj, or self-government, as the ultimate goal. During this brief window, an entire toolkit of political techniques emerged: non-cooperation, passive resistance, the deliberate filling of British jails, constructive social work. Does that list sound familiar? It definitely should, because even though these were mostly just ideas during the Swadeshi movement, this is the exact same toolkit that would later completely define Gandhian politics. The movement might have failed to give these techniques a disciplined focus at the time, but man, the future struggle would draw so heavily from the experience gained right here. Moving on to Chapter 3, The Great Surat Split, Moderates versus Extremists. This internal rivalry we mentioned earlier, it built into a spectacular 3-year collision course. Back in December 1905 at the Benares session, the cracks really began to show. The two main nationalist factions, the moderates and the extremists, clashed over whether to extend the boycott movement outside of Bengal. They managed a mild compromise to delay a fracture, but it didn't last. The very next year, 1906, in Calcutta, things really heated up. To appease the militants, the widely respected Dadabhai Naoroji was elected president, and the goal of the Congress was officially defined as Swaraja. But here is the catch. They didn't actually spell out what Swaraj meant. They left it totally open to interpretation. And finally, in 1907, at the Surat session, it all fell apart. Both sides dug their heels in with totally rigid positions, no room for compromise. The inevitable split happened, and that unified front was completely shattered. So, what exactly were they fighting about anyway? Well, the moderates advocated for constitutional methods. They wanted to keep the movement local to Bengal, and they were deeply, deeply afraid that radical actions would just provoke the mighty colonial forces into ruthlessly crushing them. The extremists, on the other hand, felt that people were ready right then. They wanted a nationwide mass movement, an aggressive boycott of all government associations, schools, and courts. Basically, push the British out now. The tragic irony of all this, the extremists didn't realize they desperately needed the moderates to act as a frontline defense against state repression. And the moderates? They didn't realize that without the energy of the extremists, they had absolutely no mass base. Neither side grasped that to take on a vast empire, you literally need both. Let's look at Chapter 4, Repression and Strategy, the Carrot and the Stick. With the nationalist movement now sliced right in two, the British saw a massive opening. This counter-strategy was the brainchild of John Morley, the Secretary of State, and it was a textbook carrot and stick approach. The whole goal was to rally the moderates to the government's side. Step 1. Mild repression. The idea here was just to spook the moderates, make them realize how dangerous the extremists were. Step 2 was conciliation, the carrot. The government dropped these little hints that if the moderates distanced themselves from the extremists, they'd be rewarded with administrative reforms. And then Step 3, suppression, the stick. Once the extremists were politically isolated, the government could just ignore the moderates entirely and use its full, unmitigated might to crush the extremists. It was incredibly calculated.
And let me tell you, that stick was heavy. Between 1907 and 1911, 5 sweeping new laws banned seditious meetings and put a chokehold on the press. Think about that number, 6 years. That represents the harsh sentence handed down to the main extremist leader, Bal Gangadhar Tilak. In 1909, he was found guilty of sedition for his writings and shipped off to Mandalay jail in Burma for 6 full years. With him locked up and other leaders either retiring or fleeing abroad, the strategy absolutely worked. The movement was suppressed.
Which leads us to Chapter 5, the Morley-Minto Reforms, legislating division. But hey, what about that carrot? What did the moderates actually get for playing along? Before we look at the specific reforms, we have to understand a really crucial concept here. Separate electorates. This is a system where voters of a particular religion or community are grouped together to elect their own specific representatives. Now, back in October 1906, a group of Muslim elites known as the Simla Deputation met with the Viceroy, Lord Minto, and they demanded this exact system to protect their community's interests. And the British? They eagerly agreed. They immediately recognized it as a highly effective political maneuver to foster division and keep the Muslim intelligentsia structurally separated from the newly radicalized Congress. The moderates actually thought these new rules, historically known as the Morley-Minto Reforms, were their grand reward. But notice how the illusion of power compares to the actual reality. On paper, sure, the number of elected members was increased. But in reality, the elections were strictly indirect. And while there was technically a non-official majority in provincial councils, that majority included people nominated directly by the British. So the actual elected members were still just a minority. Also, legislatures could finally ask questions and vote on separate budget items, which sounds great, right? Except they couldn't vote on the budget as a whole, rendering the new power pretty toothless. And while one Indian was appointed to the Viceroy's Executive Council, Satindra Sinha remained the sole appointee. The moderates totally failed to realize that these reforms were never meant to reward them. They were meticulously designed to isolate the extremists while keeping actual tangible control firmly in British hands.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer, leaving us with a pretty critical question to ponder. We've seen how the Swadeshi Movement introduced the game-changing tactics of self-rule, how the Surat Split broke the nationalist momentum, and how the Morley-Minto Reforms actively embedded religious and political divides right into the law itself. So if unity is strength, what happens when an empire literally legislates division? The tactics and the fractures forged in this intense crucible from 1905 to 1909 absolutely did not end the story. They merely set the immensely complex stage for the decades of struggle that were about to follow. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this vital piece of history. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.